On Sunday, I taught my class on Satan.
Well, isn't that special?
We talked a lot about some of the common pop culture images of Satan with the horns and the fangs and the cloven hooves. And one of the things that we find in Hebrew scripture, though, is none of those images apply. In fact, in Hebrew, the Hebrew Hasatan, from which we get a transliteration in Greek and then English as Satan, is the Satan, the accuser. And then that was later translated in Latin as Lucifer, which is interesting to note. Lucifer means one, or the light bearer. The light bearer, the one who brings light into darkness, the one who brings light and sheds light on things to give us more clarity. Somehow over time, this Hasatan has morphed into an adversary of God. The one place in the Old Testament where people oftentimes apply Satan is actually in Genesis with the snake. We have to be really careful about the veneers that we lay on top of Scripture. Nowhere in Genesis 3 is the snake associated with Hasatan or any sort of accuser. We read in Zechariah and the prophet, now the people are just coming back from Babylon. They've been in exile. He has these visions, and this is the fourth vision, I think. Then he showed me the high priest, Joshua, standing before the angel of the Lord. This is Zechariah 3. And Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. The high priests were actually being blamed for the exile. They were being blamed because they were not doing things according to God's will. Here's this high priest who had inherited this position over time, over several decades of being in exile. They come back and they start heaping all of the stuff that his ancestors did, those who came before him, and he's taking on the guilt. And here Zechariah is having this vision of, no, God is redeeming Israel. God is redeeming even the high priest Joshua. But there's Satan with the whole heavenly court. Satan is not against God. In fact, God rebukes Satan, not because Satan's a bad person, but because maybe Satan got a little overzealous. The Satan. I keep saying I should say the Satan. The Satan became a little overzealous. One of the cool comments that I heard from Walter Wink, who wrote the book Naming the Powers. Sometimes Satan is not merely a mythological character invented out of whole cloth. The adversary is actually the inner or collective voice of condemnation that any sensitive person hears, tirelessly repeating accusations of guilt or inferiority. Then we come to an interesting text. In 2 Samuel, we have one verse in particular that I think is really interesting, and it concerns the second king of Israel, David. In 24 verse 1, again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David, King David, against them, saying, go count the people of Israel and Judah. Interesting how time changes things, because in 2 Chronicles, which was written later, here in 21 verse 1, Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Here we have Satan. Now, it's not Hasatan, the Satan, but just Satan, as in maybe a proper noun. So we go from God inciting anger against the people to Satan inciting the people. The progression of theology, the progression of understanding of God through Scripture, is that early on people believed that God caused things, good or bad. If there was a massive flood or some natural disaster, God must have caused it, and it's up to us to figure out why. Over time, this Hasatan starts to take over, and suddenly it becomes Satan. And that's where we start getting into what's called scapegoat theory. And Rene Girard writes a lot about scapegoat theory, how we sort of push all of our shame and our wrongdoing onto the scapegoat, and we put it on Satan and say, well, the devil made me do it. Job. Let's go on to Job. Here even, Satan is not a fallen angel. We read in chapter 1, the very beginning, verse 6, one day the heavenly beings, or the sons or the children of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Hasatan, the Satan, was also among them. Satan is a part of God's heavenly court. I wonder if the lesson here is less about Job's faith than about this overzealousness for justice, to the point where we start even pointing fingers at good people who have done good things and continue to do good things, and we want to break them down. We want to say there's got to be some crack in that armor. Isn't that what's happening in our political arena? Everybody's trying to break and put a chink in the armor of all of our politicians. Nobody can be that good. What we find is that this Hasatan is actually a function of God. Not against God, but a function of God, working with God to try and offer some sense of accountability. Listen to Paul's words as he's writing to the church in Corinth. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. Walter Wink says, how kind of Satan to assist Paul, as he always is ready to do, when we cannot consciously let some part of our egos die. The temptation is oftentimes our own temptation, or the temptations of the world. It is the temptation to become something other than who we are. We know what kind of people we're supposed to be. We know what kind of people we're being called to be by God, but we reject that because it's not shiny and glamorous. When we personify Satan, Satan becomes the scapegoat, and then we don't have to take responsibility or be held accountable for our actions and our behavior. And maybe that's what the story of Genesis is about in Genesis 3. It's about us pushing all of our guilt and our shame onto something else, whether it's the serpent or our neighbor or our children or our parents, instead of taking responsibility. Elaine Pagels wrote a great book called The Origins of Satan. In it she says, the figure of Satan as it emerged over the centuries within Jewish tradition is not a hostile power assailing Israel from without, but a source and representation of conflict within the community. Satan comes from within the court of God. Satan comes from within our community and reflects back to us the reality of the harm and the challenge, and tempts us with our own desires so that we can see the desires, we can name them, and we can begin to understand where they're coming from and how they might be in conflict with God's desires, God's will for our lives. I've heard it said many times, and in fact in Brian McLaren's latest book, The Great Spiritual Migration, he quotes a rabbi who says, we don't take any of this stuff literally. The Bible is about meaning, about drawing meaning from events that are happening to us, not only in history, but even right now. And Walter Wink, and I know I'm quoting him a lot here, but in that same book, he has this great quote. He says, when people try to be, quote, good Christians, what is that but Satan's crowning victory? For being a good Christian is always collectively defined by some denomination or strong religious personality or some creed. One does not need to live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God in order to be a good Christian, quote unquote. One need only be pliant, docile, and obedient to those powers, to the denomination, to that personality, to that creed. Is it not easier to, quote, just let Jesus do it for us, or imitate Christ, we say, rather than embark on the risky, vulnerable, hazardous journey of seeking to find God's will in all its mundane specificity for our own lives? That harder way, he says, will certainly entail mistakes and failure, false starts, and sin masquerading as innovation. In other words, the journey of faith is dangerous. We put our lives on the line when we step into the fray, step into places of suffering like Jesus did, and trying to figure out, what does justice look like? What does love look like in this situation? And it's going to be messy, and it's going to be hard. And the problem with denominations and even churches, and even my own church, and sometimes in my own preaching, I get this, is that we try to clean it up. We try to make it palatable. And what is more palatable than blaming all my wrongs on some external entity like Satan, when in reality, the Satan is trying to help me live more faithfully by revealing to me the ways that I've fallen short, not so that I can feel guilty about them, although guilt is not necessarily a bad thing, but so that I can learn from them, grow deeper in my faith, in my understanding of not only God, but God within us. God in me, God in you, God in my neighbor, whether they claim Christian faith or Hindu or Islam. If you need that Satan to be real, fine. But I understand that Satan is not an adversary of God. That is a tool of God, seeking to help us be better people. Do we worship Satan? Absolutely not. We worship God. We believe in God. And I think that's the fundamental truth.